Welcome to the MrpTech Podcast. This is episode 43. My name is Matt. I am your host, and this is the weekly podcast discussing everyday tech for everyday people. This week's episode, the theme is the SpaceX return to flight. And I'm so excited to talk to you about this. I've been waiting about 4 months to bring this to the MrpTech Podcast. And I'm going to start off today's episode by tracing back in time all the way back to September 1st, where I was working one of the last few days of my summer job. And I happened to glance at my phone and saw news headlines lighting up everywhere talking about the anomaly on the SpaceX launch pad leading to an ultimate explosion. And immediately my thoughts were, this isn't good. This is going to put SpaceX back over a year. As anytime that this has happened really in the past, many of SpaceX competitors are on the sidelines for well over a year trying to figure out what happened to their rockets. And I sent around a few text messages, and I contacted other friends and family who are interested in SpaceX as well. And they too were disturbed by the fact of what had happened. Well, as time goes on, SpaceX puts out various messages trying to encourage their fans and supporters that they're going to get to the root of the problem. So as I went home that night and I went and watched the videos that were popping up on YouTube everywhere, people were putting out YouTube videos showing the rocket in slow motion, showing the rocket with audio correction. And I knew immediately that this was going to cause all sorts of myths and misconceptions to arise from a video that was taken from miles away. To give you an explanation on what I mean, I watched a slow motion video of the explosion, and just prior to when the explosion happens, a bird flies into the view of the camera, but because of the distance of the rocket, it looks almost like a fast-traveling airplane, or for conspiracy theorists out there, a UFO. But if you really slowed it down and took a look, you would realize that this was just a bird flying in front of the camera, and it's a optical illusion of sorts, causing people to create these ridiculous assumptions. Other myths out there that happen to be acknowledged by SpaceX include things like sabotage, where SpaceX was actually investigating the fact that some of their video feeds showed employees of competing companies on the rooftops of their buildings just prior to this explosion. Now, this wasn't just before a launch. This was several days before a launch, during what's called a static test fire, where they check everything up into igniting the engines for launch, but not releasing the rocket itself. So during these static test fires, standard procedure is to remove everyone from the launch area and to fuel the rockets as you would per a normal launch. And something led up to the explosion destroying the Falcon 9 rocket and its payload. So over the next few months, SpaceX conducted an investigation alongside the FAA and other organizations such as NASA to really hone in on what caused the problem. There was over 1,000 video feeds covering just, I believe it was 0.33 seconds worth of video to try to find exactly the root of cause of the problem. Now, in early December, SpaceX put an announcement out saying that they found the issue and have corrected the issue and are ready to return to flight. So let's talk a little bit about their findings. So first of all, the rupture happened in the second stage of the rocket. And in the second stage itself are helium tanks. These types of rockets, SpaceX specifically, uses densified propellants, which they can get 10% more fuel density by chilling these propellants to as close to freezing as they possibly can get. Now, inside the second stage, these helium tanks are stored inside of liquid oxygen tanks. And the helium is stored as high-pressured gas. These helium tanks are called COPVs, composite overwrapped pressure vessels. They're basically aluminum tanks that are wrapped in carbon fiber. And as the helium is stored inside these tanks, they're stored as high-pressure gas, and the pressure of these tanks will increase as fueling continues. So, including things like liquid oxygen, as the liquid oxygen is pumped into the second stage itself, there are small gaps in the carbon fiber wrapping that liquid oxygen can move into, and the carbon fiber normally absorbs these and is perfectly fine. But because of the low temperatures, once the liquid oxygen moves in some cases it's found to actually freeze. And when it does this, it creates an expansion and it creates friction that can cause combustion, and therefore resulting in the ruptured second stage and the ultimate anomaly or explosion on the pad. So what does this mean exactly? Well, what it means is that there wasn't actually a problem with the rocket itself. What required changing was the loading procedures of the fuel. And that is what ultimately led to a rapid return to flight. So over the next few months, from September to December, once the root of the problem was found, SpaceX began to test and to try through trial and error in McGregor, Texas, to find these problems and come up with a procedure to stop this from happening in the future. So after they were confidently causing these failures, and neighbors in McGregor, Texas hearing explosions quite frequently, it was assumed that they found the problem and were working on fixes for it. So in December, SpaceX mentions they are ready for return to flight. However, there was one problem. The investigation by the FAA had not concluded yet, and they were not granted approval for launch. So their December 16th return to flight date was bumped into January. And as we got closer to January 6th became the targeted launch date. But we still had not heard from the FAA at all, and the launch was ultimately postponed due to poor weather for almost a week and range conflicts with other competing companies doing their static test fires on the same day practically as SpaceX. So as January 6th passed, the FAA approval came down the pipeline, and the launch date was bumped to January 14th, in which the Falcon 9 would be launching the Iridium 1 replacement satellites, 10 satellites, set to replace communication satellites that have been in use for about 20 years, and they are actually well past their intended lifespans. So Iridium 1, if you're not sure what Iridium is, it's a company providing mobile and voice communication through satellites. There are over 60 satellites surrounding Earth for satellite telephone use. And over the next year, SpaceX plans on replacing many of these satellites as they are aged out, and they're hopeful to get this up all within 2017. Now, just prior to launch, winds were very much a concern, and I was actually watching the weather in Vandenberg, California, and I noticed that there was even small craft advisories out in the Pacific Ocean. I was curious how this was going to affect the landing of the rockets themselves on the ASDS, which is the Autonomous Spaceport drone ships. And with a 60% chance of favorable weather and 60% chance of launch, Would they be able to attempt these landings if the waves in the ocean were not complying with them? Well, as it turns out, that these barge ships and the rocket itself has such a low center of gravity that it doesn't really matter too much with the waves out on the Pacific Ocean. So the ASDS, the drone ship, Just Read the Instructions, was sent out into the ocean to capture the returning first stage of the Falcon 9. And if you're not sure where these names come from, Just Read the Instruction is the West Coast drone ship. And Of Course I Still Love You is the East Coast drone ship. These are taken from an Ian Banks book, the Culture Book series, Player of Games. And I really love SpaceX's approach to their good sense of humor and really modern way of thinking by all of the pop culture references that they have started using over the last several years. To give you another example, they're building another spaceport in Boca Chica, Texas, and one of those buildings that are being built is called the Stargate building. And if you go into their main offices, rumor has it that there is a Cylon Raider waiting to welcome you as you walk into the building. And I think it's absolutely hysterical. I think it's in great taste. And I'm looking forward to more pop culture references to come over the next few years. And so getting back into just before launch now, the weather was beautiful outside. There was hardly any clouds in the sky. And thousands of people came to watch this launch. The Falcon 9 did launch, and all 10 Iridium 1 satellites were deployed in the correct orbit. And the first stage made its way back down to the drone ship. And this time, there were better video feeds, in my opinion. In the past, sometimes the satellite feed, due to vibrations from the rocket itself, the satellite feed actually would cut out, and it seemed a little choppy. This time they put a video on the rocket itself, and you could watch the rocket slowly making its way towards the ocean and finally seeing the drone ship. And then, in my opinion, where the humor is, reading the words, just read the instructions, and landing the rocket on the platform way out in the middle of the ocean is not a small task by any means. This rocket was using a single engine re-entry burn. They can use up to 3 engines at a time. The single engine is a little slower and a little bit more controlled, and they happen to be able to do it this time. They can't do that with every single launch, but it shows that they are fine-tuning their launch capabilities with the Falcon 9. And the reason for that is because they want to make the Falcon 9 reusable and reliable and make any final changes to that before they get into launching the Falcon Heavy, which is set to debut in a few months. With this launch, I was fully expecting them to have a perfect launch. I think they really needed it. SpaceX claims to have $10 billion in their bank account and 0 debt. I don't know if that's true or not. But these Falcon 9 rockets will come together and 3 of them will launch what will be called the Falcon Heavy rocket. It'll be the largest rocket since the Saturn V rocket of the Apollo days. And so it'll be the world's largest rocket in production. And that gears up towards the launch of the IITS, the Interplanetary Transport System, a crazy large rocket with 42 engines meant for man's eventual colonization of the outer solar system, which I find really interesting. This, of course, is years down the road now, but testing has begun, and certain important milestones have already been made for this type of transport system. If you're like most people are skeptics at this point, and can this really be done by SpaceX? I'm a skeptic to a certain point. I'm a huge fan of SpaceX, but I do want to say that I want to encourage all of those people out there who are fans or maybe not fans to give them a shot, to give them a chance, because they're doing something great for all of us. Now, Elon Musk plans to launch 4,000 satellites that provide internet access globally, and he plans on using the revenue from those satellites and the internet provided to fund his Mars program, which I think is a pretty incredible task in its own right, providing global internet. So we'll see where it goes over the next few years, and please let me know did you watch the launch, and what do you think of SpaceX, their reusability techniques, trying to reuse rockets? Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it's important? And let me know. One of the great things that I sort of got into rocket science and stuff, I've never expected to get into something like rocket science. But as an educator, I'm always trying to learn new things, and I'm trying to get into different things that I never would have gotten into in the past. And that's what makes this podcast so fun for me, is relaying all of this information. So if you've got some thoughts, you can send them my way. I'll put them in a future episode. You can write me an email, or mrptechreviews@gmail.com, or record your own voice and send it my way. I'll put it in the show for you. Along with SpaceX's return to flight, I did want to talk a little bit more about these Iridium satellites. Now, the older Iridium satellites, if you're not sure and you're unaware of these satellites, when they reconfigure their orbits, they create bright flares in the sky. And you can actually see these satellites on occasion if you catch them at the right time. And there is an app for iOS. It's called Sputnik. And it will tell you when these Iridium satellites are flying over your area. The app is not available for Android at this point in time. I could not find the alternative app. I believe that there should be one. I didn't have a whole lot of time to search for it. But there is a Sputnik app on Android, but it is for other purposes other than satellite tracking. And this Sputnik app is similar to the ISS, International Space Station tracking app that I mentioned in previous podcasts, but this one tracks the Iridium satellites, and you can catch them traveling across the sky at certain points during the night. So I encourage you guys to try that app out. I've tried it out a little bit. I did manage to see one Iridium satellite. Thought it was kind of cool. So if you're into astronomy, that's my app pick for you for this week. And all right, as we move on now, last week's episode was a Google-themed episode where I talked about my quest towards becoming a Google certified trainer. And I had passed my level 1 exam, level 1 educator exam. And this week I've been working on level 2 certified educator for Google. And I did the training, and I did the study guide for it and passed the level 2 exam. And I also moved on to the trainer skills assessment, and I took and passed that exam as well. I think I'm going to save my details for what I think of those two training resources for next week's episode. But I did seem to have a lot of interest in the Google Apps for Education, so I'm going to keep moving forward with that for next week. But for right now, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Got a lot of great things coming up in the next few weeks. I hope you check out podnuts.com for all the great shows over at Podnuts. And my website, you can always take a look. It's www.mrptechreviews.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.